I remember people saying, God, you got a kid now and more kids you're planning, and how can you take that risk? And it occurred to me that the biggest risk I had was that someday I was going to walk into my job and tell my boss something stupid that I thought of him or whatever, and all of a sudden I don't have a job at all. So we want to put some guardrails on how much a failure would be. What we're really trying to do is buy information, and we're paying tuition. And if we learn something, we're going to learn what we can do.
Maui Mastermind presents the Business Coach Podcast, answering your questions and providing real actionable insights for building a better, stronger, more profitable business without sacrificing your time, life, or freedom anymore.
Well, welcome to the Business Coach. I'm your host, David Finkel, and I think you're going to really enjoy what I have in store for you today. Today I'm going to be joined by a guest, Joe Brotherton. Now, Joe is a friend who is a very successful business person. He's a serial entrepreneur, and he has an amazing story, and I'll share that with you briefly here. Why this interview, I think, is so important is Joe and I dive deeply into risk, what it really is for an entrepreneur or a business owner. How can we use pilots and test studies to make intelligent moves, to spend some money to get information that allows us to massively tilt the playing field in our advantages. And we have a really interesting conversation about that. There's one more thing that's in here that I walked away having learned from Joe. So Joe is a serial business owner. He started off, he's an ex-hippie. I mean, it's an amazing story. An ex-hippie who fell in love early on with Maureen, his wife, when they were in their teens. They've been together 50 years, if you can imagine, married 50 years, which I think is wonderful. They've successfully raised their kids, which for me always means as much, if not more, than just the fact that he's built, scaled, and sold successfully multiple companies, some for fairly substantial amounts of money. At the same time, he's been a buy and improve and hold real estate investor now for 30 plus years. Including owning the iconic Doe Bay Resort out in the San Juan Islands area and in the Seattle area in the Pacific Northwest, office, apartment space, things of those nature. He's a really bright business person. He started off actually after his hippie days were semi-over. I think he's still a hippie in his own way. I think he sees himself that way. He's got free spirit for sure. But he went back to and got his law degree and his CPA education and designation. And he worked in the world of consulting for Price Waterhouse. That was back before they were Price Waterhouse Coopers. And he one day had this experience where he was helping as the attorney, one of his clients, close a real estate transaction. Whereas Joe described it, he was the one who found the deal. Joe was the one who put together the financing for the deal. Joe did the underwriting and due diligence for the deal. And Joe did all the closing for the deal. Joe made a substantial payment as a professional, $25,000 for his work, which a number of years ago was a lot, and this guy made $1 million on it. And Joe said, well, look, I was trained in math. 25,000, 1 million, that was the time that Joe went out and became a business owner himself. And he's gone through successive cycles of buying and or building and starting companies, scaling them and selling them. He's done them in parallel. He's had 5 successful exits so far. He's got 2 more operating companies that will have exits in the next 2 or 3 years. A really, really inspiring but also informative interview. The one more thing that he shared in this interview that I never had known, I've been doing real estate now for 30 years, and I've been working with clients, coaching clients who, as part of what they do, either as their main business as a real estate investment company, or people who own clients who in other businesses still do real estate on the side as a way of allocating a portion of their net worth. And so I've been involved with advising on hundreds of different real estate transactions, probably thousands at this point over the last 30 years. And I had never known this about insurance. So he shares a little known secret about how to negotiate if you do have a major casualty loss, fire or some other reason with the insurance side, and why that very first meeting with the adjuster that you meet out there at the property is extraordinarily important. And he shared something that I never had heard before, and it's on this week's episode. So without further ado, please welcome and join Joe Brotherton. Joe is one of the Maui advisors. He's been at various events of ours, sharing his expertise, and we're so pleased to have him share the best of what he knows about risk and some other things that we'll get into in this conversation here today. So welcome to the Business Coach Podcast, and here is that interview with Joe Brotherton. Well, Joe, welcome to the Business Coach Podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. I'm in Seattle today and a little bit of sun coming through, so that's working.
That's great. I know you and I had an earlier conversation about different times of the year for Seattle and different times of the year for you to head out to your place in Hawaii. I'm curious for you, did that only happen after your kids flew the coop and kind of had lives of their own where that was, or did you do that back when your kids were younger too?
We always had some seasonal things. I was a soccer coach for all of our kids and played soccer. And so fall season, my businesses all fell apart because I just wouldn't give them time and coaching 4 or 5 teams. And so I've always had this idea of seasonality. Now it's easier where I can kind of go, I keep my winters open for the mountains because I don't know how many years of snowboarding I have left. And I know if I'm going to be in Hawaii, I won't be in Sun Valley. And then the Northwest for the summertime is just unbeatable.
Yeah.
We do it shoulder season, we go to Hawaii or go on some travel elsewhere in the world. So
Great sense.
with 5 kids, they really never did fly the coop. By the time the last one was out, the grandchildren were in, and so never
You
been
had a
real.
conveyor belt.
Yeah, yeah.
That's great. Well, Joe, I guess the place I want to start in our conversation here today is, you have a pretty interesting, unique background, right? You started off once upon a time with the attorney and the CPA background for you. You went into the world with Price Waterhouse and doing consulting, but how did you make the leap into owning a business versus working as a professional helping other businesses? How did you make the leap to do this yourself?
Yeah, I think it was a certain predisposition, but I was also just doing the math. I remember fairly clearly an experience where I was helping a guy put together a real estate deal, and it was a pretty large deal. And I really did almost all of it. I did the negotiation, the finding of the property, the negotiations, the acquisition, the financing, and I probably got a $25,000 fee, which was a ton of money at the time. But I think he made $1 million. Even I can do that math. It just seemed like that was a better seat to be in at the table at the end there. So,
Oh, that's great. I never had gone that route. I jumped in straight away 30 years ago with the business side, but that's interesting for that part. And I'm curious, friends and family, hey, you're on the right track, or hey, you're crazy for doing it way back when you originally did the route of owning the business versus working as a professional in a business.
the only time I remember any feedback was when I left Price Waterhouse to start my business again. Been doing consulting before, doing computer systems during business school as an undergrad, and then went to Price Waterhouse, had a great time there. But I remember people saying, "Guy, you got a kid now and more kids you're planning, and how can you take that risk?" And it occurred to me that the biggest risk I had was that someday I was going to walk into my job and tell my boss, the partner in charge, something stupid that I thought of him or whatever, and all of a sudden I don't have a job at all. I thought the risk of that was more daunting to me than having the risk of having to find clients and make deals with them. And so that was, I remember people said, "Hey, you're crazy. How can you take that much risk?" And I'm pleased that I did.
Of course. I mean, it's worked out fantastically well. Were you already married to Maureen when you made that leap? And did she I wasn't married to Heather at that point. I made the leap for me. I was 26. I had done one business prior that had flopped before the second one worked well. And, so when Heather met me, I was already a business owner with a successful company. I'm curious, how early were you and Maureen married?
Maureen and I have our 50th wedding anniversary coming up in September, and we met when we were 16 to 17. So, yeah, we definitely grew through all of this stuff together, and she's been a great partner, which is a valuable thing to have.
So let's dive into risk a little bit. I know you've given this lots of thought. I know I have, looking at client businesses and businesses that I've run, investments that I've been part of. And it seems that a lot of crap is talked about what's risky out there and a lot of misunderstandings about risk. Let's just start with this question. How do you, Joe, when you think about business risk or investment risk, how is it that you're looking at it that is different than what people think about in the mainstream media that seems to inculcate some pretty big misconceptions about what actually is risk?
And probably have a couple thoughts on the issue. The thing about real estate deals are a nice way to to understand this issue where, whatever your abilities and net worth might be. So let's say you're going to buy a $8 million property, and your friends again will look at you like, you're out of your mind. How can you take that much risk? It's $8 million. And I always looked at it, I thought, if I'm dead wrong, I've got $400,000 of risk on a deal like that. I mean, if I'd have to be so wrong to lose 8 million by buying an 8 million, that meant that I thought it was worth 8 million and it was actually worth nothing. So one thing is that just big numbers scare people. And that's something you got to watch in yourself. You got to say, wait a minute, I got to see what am I actually at risk, not just what the numbers going across the page are. Another thing that might give you some insight on it, David, is I remember one of my sons was asking me something about, Dad, how have you had such good fortune? I mean, I think he was secretly trying to say, I know you're not that smart. How did you ever end up having all these successes? He was kind of asking me the question. And, I said, Lewis, I'll tell you, I'm a pretty smart guy. On a good day, I might be worth 50, 60 bucks an hour, maybe 75. So how come sometimes do I make whatever the number is, much, much bigger number, day and night, all year round? And I said, it's strictly because I gamble. I'm not any smarter. I can only work so many hours in the day. So it's not like I just produced more, but I analyze risk. And when I get the odds in my favor, just like on television, you go all in. And so I think that gives you a little bit of insight into my way of looking at it.
Let's unpack a little bit of it. So, one of the things your comment about big numbers scare people, talk about that for a moment. I mean, my observation is, and we can stay with real estate. I know a lot of our coaching clients do either they bought their own building or they invest in real estate outside of their company. It's a good one as a vehicle to have this conversation. And so, I was having a conversation recently with a guy I placed some money with, and I just on advice of one of my mastermind partners, I invited my two older sons and said, hey, do you want to be part of this phone call just to listen in and learn a little bit? And one of my two sons, Matthew, said, yeah, Dad, I'd love to. I want to learn how to invest in real estate. And it was really interesting. He's not going to hear any of that from me. So the fact that your son came to you and said, how did you, I love that. My son was listening to this other guy, asking questions. And one of the comments this guy made was, well, he had two other people that he knows did business with. One guy had recently picked up a property for over $20 million, but he only had it under contract, ended up selling his position in the contract and assigning someone else for several $1,000,000. And my son was like, you can do that? And the key with that is what allows that to happen is to some degree, one of two things. Either you have the confidence or you can make the numbers become less real. What I mean by that on my side, I've seen is that some people can do bigger deals because the numbers feel fictional to them anyways. And usually it's the employee who can do that. The moment we describe ownership, it seems like it makes it more real. And I do notice people get scared of that, whether it's in their company with how they deal with pricing. Oh, I could never raise my price from, $1,000 an hour to $2,000 an hour, even though we produce the value, and it scares them. Does that spark anything in your experiences?
Yeah, I was going to say there's an analogy which you have to have a little bit of Las Vegas experience to appreciate, but if you ever go to a gaming center like Las Vegas, the percentages that the house have are tiny. I mean, it's a point. It's 3 points on the crazy games, but you play the straight games, craps and so forth, you can get down to where they only have 50.5%, and you have a 49.5%. They're going to make money over time doing that, but it's not any massive amount. And if you can ever get a bet where you're at even or up a little bit, then you push money on the table. Now, in business, when you're working on a deal, the moment I start talking about a deal, I say, I attach a percentage of likelihood that this is going to happen. And I think about that every day. Okay, this one's up to 40%. Now something goes sideways. Now we drop down to 20%. Oh, this looks like 75%. But in addition, I'm looking at the risk and return. And, you'll get to a point where you say, God, this deal, I mean, I got a 75% chance of having this be successful. Well, again, in Las Vegas, you would go crazy. You'd be grabbing everybody and say, throw your money on this deal. But the way most people hear that, I have a 25% chance of losing, and they walk away from it. So it's just a matter of, what kind of, what is it, intestinal fortitude do you have? Or maybe it's a blind faith that just says, yeah, I can take a 25% chance to lose with a 75% chance of winning. And again, just most people are not trained to think of it that way.
the framing with that, one of the things I like, you had said something before. You said, what's actually at risk is the question you said. That's a question I use a lot. And I coach clients on this all the time. And I'll give two examples for it. They think about hiring somebody for running their operations, and they have a choice between two categories of people. One category of person might cost 80 to 100 grand. The second category of person might be 120 to 150. And in their head, they think, oh my gosh, I don't want to have this much at risk. And they think what's at risk is the 150 if they were to pay someone that. And I'm like, hang on a second here. Joanne, if you hire this person and they clearly are not a fit, how long is it going to take for you to figure that out? Well, probably within 3 to maybe 4 months. Okay. So worst comes to worst, what's really at risk is 3 to 4 months, or 25 to 30-ish% of that 150. So it's a lot less than that.
Right.
And then we ask the question, what happens if you don't, which we'll come back to. And the other one I was going to just share as an example is I love free options or cheap options. Hiring someone is an option. I don't have to keep them forever in most everywhere, at least in the US. Maybe if I were in France and there's different labor laws, I'd have differently. But also, like, for example, I see someone who picks up a new office lease. I'm like, you have a 5-year lease. Why haven't you asked for 2 renewals, right? You don't have to renew it, but why not get the option for it? Or, you're going to go ahead and change to a new supplier. Why not see if they'll give you locked in pricing or give you a guarantee that the pricing won't go up more than 5% every 12 months? Or why wouldn't you do that? It doesn't cost you anything, and it gives you opportunity. It's a way of, I look at it as, how can I reduce risk but still give myself the play of the upside? What does that spark for you?
Yeah, when you give the analogy about the business person leasing space, I'm usually on the other side of that. I have more real estate deals where I'm on the landlord side, and I can promise you, that's the analysis the landlord's going through. Do I have to give this person an option? What does that do to me 3 years out or 5 years out when the initial term terminates? And usually, you always want them to stay anyway, so it doesn't really make that much difference. But it's a lot more fun to start the discussion with, gosh, I know you're happy in the space. You got all your stuff there. It'd be very expensive to move, and you don't really have an option to stay. So we're looking in the market here. It has gotten so much better. And so, one of the things I've taught ethics for years, and I just gave my first ethics presentation in a long time, just this last day before yesterday. And so here's an ethical one that's kind of interesting. So the landlord sees that the tenant is supposed to give notice of execution of their option. So, and say it's by March 31st. On March 1st, you contact them and say, what's going on with this? And this is, again, you're assuming they kind of like being there. You don't have an obligation to remind them. And it's always been a close call for me, but I typically will let the option expire and then reach out to them and say, gosh, I'm sorry that you didn't execute. And, is there anything we can do to keep you in the building and so forth? And that's where, again, it's exactly the thing you described of who has the right. And then, you don't have to take undue advantage when you have the power, but it's nice to be in the position to kind of say, gosh, I'm such a good guy that I don't have any obligation to keep renting to you, but I want you there. It changes the tenor of the negotiation, let's say. So
Sure it does. I love that idea. And it's funny, it's same example, just from the opposite end of the transaction with that part.
right.
And, as I think about optionality, we think about formal options, the contractual right that says you can have the option to purchase, to buy, to renew, to whatever. But I know with clients of ours, we often will coach them about what I'll call an indirect or informal option. And the best example I can share with that would be a marketing test, right? So I know you've got your painting and coating company, your manufacturing practice, right? And so, there might be a new market you guys want to test, and you might say, we think if we were to do this marketplace, these are the 2 variables that will tell us it's worthwhile going into it. Great. How do we test those variables? How can I test it for $10, $20, $30,000 where my risk is limited, but if it works, the upside might be 100 or 1,000x, not percent, but X. And so I'm curious, when you look at that, I know you do that intuitively and naturally because you've just risk and reward for you is a calculation you clearly see. I have a 75% chance of winning, and my winning is not a doubling. It's a 10x, it's a 100x with that part. How do you find that you, in your what role has experimentation and playing tests, whether it be marketing or with people or with products and services and offerings, what role has testing played
Yeah,
as a way for you to use that? We'll use the analogy of a informal option to explore opportunities to make a lot more money.
yeah, it's interesting because I haven't really thought about it that much in that way over the years, except I've noticed in the last 5 or 7 years with the operating businesses I have that I use the word pilot more often than I used to. Okay, so let's do a pilot. It's all risk. It could completely fail. And so we want to put some guardrails on how much a failure would be. What we're really trying to do is buy information and we're paying tuition. And if we learn something, we're going to learn what we can do. And now we get to make a more informed allocation of capital once we've got that information. So that's kind of the way I look at it. Again, I'd probably have to reflect for a while to think of whether that was part of my DNA 25 or 30 years ago when I was much more active. But as I say, it caught me off guard recently when I was using the word pilot in 3 different business discussions that were unrelated. And I realized, oh, I guess this is a new approach that I've kind of adopted. So,
I think for me, 20, 25 years ago, I would never have thought this way. I wasn't intuitive at all. But if I look at the last 15-ish years, I notice more and more with clients, it just becomes obvious. I'm watching what they're doing and I see that they've got a strategy that if it works, the payoff is big. And they're freezing at the point of pulling the trigger to execute because they think it's all or nothing.
right.
When really it's one of those things that you could have a ratchet approach where we'll put something on the table and that something is at risk, survivable risk, 10 grand, 50 grand, 100 grand, depending on that part. And I think that different approach, and I know for me, what I'll often tell them is saying, look, if you look at this, let's ask the question, what would you need to see that tells you this isn't working? And how do you measure and observe that? And what would tell you it is working? And how do you measure and observe that? And essentially, if we get good at setting up the pilot so we know what we're paying attention to, both positive things and negative things, I find that when they realize that they really aren't risking the farm, they're risking 10 grand, 50 grand, 100 grand.
The way you've described it, I have not used that term of kind of optionality, that really you're out there trying to get options to do things. And that's gonna inform me in terms of how I approach some of these things. Though the analogy I always used was keeping one foot on the dock. So you're sitting there, the boat's getting ready to leave, and you got one foot on the dock and one on the boat, and you're looking at the boat, and you're looking at the crew, and you're looking at the weather, and you're saying, am I going to go or not go? And I always say that I like to keep one foot on the dock as long as I can so that I can still say, oh, wait, I just got a couple of bad signals here. I'm going to basically step back on the dock and wave these guys off. And so, yeah, so the idea that at some point you have to make a commitment. The other analogy is that, in a card game, when you're playing poker, do you really want to put up another blue chip just to get your next card? And you want to stay in the game as long as you can because it's what we used to call in law school the value of a chance. And it's always my contracts professor used that phrase, and it was never a big deal to anybody, but it stuck with me. And many times I think about, well, what I'm really buying here is the value of a chance that it could really work well, and this could be a really good deal. So,
As I hear those things, it sparked for me this idea, and I'm laughing at you use a boat analogy, which makes sense for a man who owns a resort on an island in the Seattle area. Those are listening or watching the podcast, you won't know this, but Joe and I share a mutually dear friend, Kieran, who's one of the Maui advisors and is at our Success Summit. And Kieran's a pilot. And so I'm assuming that he's going to have the same analogy being one foot on the tarmac and one foot on the plane. I got my start into business in a business that did lots of lease options way back when. So I do think with that term, it's just kind of funny to me. But this idea of the value of a chance, I really like that. Thanks. And I was watching, I don't know if you ever saw this movie, 21. It was a movie about a group of people from MIT who went to Las Vegas and counted cards. And I mean, it's a silly movie in its own way. I was watching with my kids. My wife and I were laughing. But one of the things is, if you think about it, if you could legally and without the people in the casino getting upset with you physically for counting cards,
Right?
Then you put up your bet and you get to find more information about what's going on with the deck. You called that earlier on. I love that. You said you're going to use this to buy information, your pilot to buy information. That's essentially what's happening. And it's a different way to think. And when I look at those people I know who built $50 million companies, $250 million companies or greater, there is a bigger willingness to get over the number and recognize that if they can think about it as I'm paying for information or I'm trying an experiment, or in your case, a pilot, they're more willing to go bigger trying things sooner without the fearful hand wringing, should I, shouldn't I, because they've capped the downside that's more than survivable, where the upside is, tails I lose $20,000, heads I win $2 million. That's a no-brainer bet, providing I can survive the loss of $20,000. So I love the way you're looking at that.
David, there's an interesting part two of it, which is when you have, whether you were smart enough to really tell yourself it was a pilot, one way or another, you did something, you bet a bunch of money and it didn't work. There's natural tendency to just go, oh, I hated that whole experience. It was awful. I'm not doing it. I'm not putting any more into this deal or whatever it is. And a lot of times I started using the phrase in meetings with people. I say, no, wait a minute. We paid the tuition. I spent $6 million learning about doing that in Japan. And now I'm going to just pull out of Japan. How crazy would that be? I finally know what I'm doing. And just because I got grumpy because I left a bunch of money on the table, why waste the experience and the knowledge that you bought? So, but emotionally, it's still hard to step back into a ring where you got pummeled. So,
And what you said, I think it's so important, this idea that we can recycle, right? The lesson. And I think as business owners, the more successful you are, what that means is you've gotten better at taking experiences and really drawing forward the useful part and applying it somewhere else or compounding it over time. And I watch a lot of fledgling business owners, and do you see this too, where they jump from thing to thing so frequently that they never really gain momentum and never allow their advantages to compound in the business or industry by not sticking with it long enough. I don't know if you've noticed that with young entrepreneurs, young not in age necessarily, but in the
in
maturing the
experience, yeah.
business.
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt that the experience is cumulative. You mentioned I was a consultant with Price Waterhouse in Seattle and New York because I was a computer guy when I was younger. And the chance to go inside a business where they tell you all their secrets is so invaluable. And you actually become a way better consultant the longer you do it, because the first consulting project you get, you don't really know that much. You know whatever we taught you in business school, and you know the rules. The second one, maybe a little better. The third or fourth one, you start to look back and say, wow, this reminds me of that first client I had. They did this way. Look at the way these guys are using 3 times as many people to get that function done. I'm going to tell them they should use fewer people and they're going to treat me like a genius, which they do. And all you did was steal the idea from your other client. But yeah, getting a chance to see a number of businesses. And then the great benefit of just becoming an old guy that's been in business forever is I really can think of something analogous about almost every conundrum that I face. Not always. There are some new ones in the modern day and age, but by and large.
There's a book that I was really enjoying. I've been reading it this week called Buffett and Munger Unscripted. It's someone took a lot of the transcripts from, 50, 60 years of these various board meetings and shareholder meetings that they've run, and they've just shared that part in organization. So I was reading a section on it. Munger was saying that the thing that's made the difference for why Warren is as good as he is that he's never stopped learning, which I think that's a real value. I know for you, you put a premium on learning. I know the people I've seen who've been able to continue to grow their success, not just ride their success. There's an element that they have to keep investing that part. So I'm going to pick your brain on something here.
Okay.
So one way of thinking about risk is management of risk. And you had shared recently about an example of how you had at one of your commercial properties wherein a fire occurred and you have insurance. And I even just talking about that and understanding risk, because some people look at that and think insurance, I'm paying a premium. And when you frame it as insurance, everyone says, of course, I've got a $10 million building. I'm going to buy insurance. But insurance is nothing more than an option. I pay the premium, and then if something happens, fire, in theory, I get the option to get my money back with that part. I mean, it's a strange way of looking at it. I take the known loss of the premium. In exchange for it, some condition allows me to take the gain from the insurance paying off. And no one thinks that you should go around without insurance that's got any intelligence with that. But in terms of managing risk, I'm curious, what did you learn about, like, well, first of all, give us the practical. What's it actually like to have a major loss like that happen and deal with an insurance company? I'm curious because there's some practicalities with that I'm sure you could share with us.
Yeah, I was actually going to not answer your question because I didn't like the question as much as I liked my answer. And because there's one thing I do want to share about it, but I want to start out by saying, just remember what insurance is. That's just shifting of risk. So you look at something, you say, hey, look, I can take $100,000 risk, but and I look at my net worth. Can I take $1 million? Maybe. Can I take 5 million? Maybe. But at some point, you just go, well, this would be foolhardy to not shift some of the risk, especially if it doesn't cost me too much. And so that's what you're doing with insurance. We could have discussions about life insurance. I'm kind of anti-life insurance for people once they acquire any reasonable amount of wealth. You're doing it in the early years when you can't leave your family with nothing, but it's not an especially good bet quite a ways later. But because that's fresh in my mind, this very large claim that I just dealt with, one thing I learned having prosecuted this, I know, probably 5 medium to large size insurance claims on various things that I've owned, that's an easy one for people to hear and remember, which is the first meeting with the adjuster is your most important meeting. And if you just lost a $2 million building, you walk around with the adjuster and say, this is 10 or $15 million. Now, they're smart. They're not going to take 10 or 15, but when they were getting ready to say 1.5, they might write 2 for a reserve amount. And just knowing a little bit about the way the insurance industry works is real valuable when you're entering a negotiation on this, because what happens is if you get them to set up a $2 million reserve, that's what the initial adjuster says, and you start proving your case, hey, this is a $3 million claim, I promise you that last $1 million, no matter how proper, fair, and so forth it is, well documented, they're going to fight like crazy because the regulators come down on them hard for having under reserved. So they don't ever want to have a claim that goes over their reserve amount. So they're already predisposed to give you kind of a big number. And it's a long game that you're playing. And so that first meeting is so important to get the biggest number in the adjuster's head. So that's what he or she writes down on the paper that the insurance company then sets aside technically with their accounting procedures, because working within that will always be relatively easy. Working outside of it is disproportionately difficult. So that wasn't the answer to your question.
No, I want to stay with that for a second. That's gold. So I'm always sharing to participants in the podcast, to listeners, to viewers, that their goal should be to take one concrete, valuable idea each episode. And you just gave me mine for today, Joe, which is fantastic. I'll look for a couple others because I'm greedy in a good way. But I've dealt with fires, and also I've had many clients who've dealt with that. This is the first time anyone's ever shared with me about that reserve number as a process for what they need to do, both for the underwriter and the insurance company and their regulators. So thank you for that. That's golden right there. And it's interesting. That's your experience set plus your background allowed you to spot something that I don't think is common knowledge based on how I've talked to plenty of people.
Yeah, I love telling the story because people by and large, even people with quite a bit of experience, kind of go, I kind of knew that, but I didn't know I could do anything about it. Well, I mean, it all gets decided right on that front end. And that's not a real sophisticated process. The guy that comes in initially, he's walking around and you're whispering in his ear, yeah, that was expensive there. That's going to cost a fortune to rebuild. And so you have as much influence as you can. And maybe it's one of those things where I just fool myself that I'm having some influence, but I'm a believer in it. And it's produced some returns, let's say, over the years.
Yeah, I mean, you're anchoring the person just by mentioning the $10 million. That number is the starting point. There's lots of great social psychology data that backs up, that says that first number, whether it's directly related or completely different, is going to change where the other person's number will come in. That to me is brilliant.
I guess something to talk about then, because when you mentioned social psychology, so when I went back to school, I was a musician, hippie, crazy, didn't care about anything. All of a sudden, I go back to school and I got real practical about computers and then also about business. And the social sciences just seem like fake science to me. Oh my God. Because at the university to graduate, you have to take soc, psych, or anthro. And those are just a big waste of time. I would say in the last 20 years, my understanding of psychology has been more valuable to me than my understanding of law or accounting or many of these other things. So, the fact that you cite the social psychologist saying that, hey, if you tell them this number, that's what they're going to remember is brilliant and really useful. So, anyway, so hats off to all those psychology majors out there.
I've got one more question as we're coming to the end of this episode here. And so here's my question for you. I want to just bring up. So when you're thinking, we'll just even put it this way here. When you're thinking about the moves that have made business owners successful and the things that you've done, I mean, I know you've taken multiple, how many companies was it that you've sold now? I know about at least 4, but I
Yeah,
actually think it was more than that. How many did you actually sell?
I've done more or less 5 or 6 exits and have 2 operating companies now that I'll work over the next couple of years.
That's fantastic. So when you think about that and you're going to sell, one of the things I've noticed is that most people on the sales side, they more and more are getting purchased, our clients, by private equity groups. I did a recent podcast about the games and tactics private equity buyers play. But coming back to this idea of the comfort level with it, I watch fear play a big part in that sale process, wherein the private equity groups stall the sale toward the end to extend it and create deal fatigue. It's a standard play I've watched them do against clients of ours time and time again. But what comes in there when I talk to the client is you can almost feel the palpable sense of fear they have of, if this deal falls apart, like it feels scary to them. And I'm wondering, as we're talking about fear, as someone who's had the exits, have you ever had an exit deal fall apart? And what was the reality of it versus the fear-based fantasy that people build of a sale falling through?
It's an interesting question, and it goes back to kind of again one of my standards, which is I'll tell you the story. So I owned a company called Sweet Licks that manufactured molasses blocks that cows ate for supplemental feedings. It was a very funny business to be owned by at that time vegetarians, because I'd go to the cattlemen's office. And I guarantee I was the only person ordering tofu at the cattlemen's convention. But anyway, a saying that people will hear me say in a meeting sometimes, especially to an old partner or friend that I've done deals with, is watch out for the piano. And other people may or may not know what I'm talking about, but my friends know exactly what I mean. And it's based really, I think, on a Gary Larson cartoon where 2 guys are standing in front of the building going, God, life just couldn't get any better. And then you look up in the cartoon and there's a piano falling from the 3rd floor. And so the example on Sweet Licks, I had the deal sold. I sold it, and it was a lot of work. I said it sold to this company in Australia. I got to know the CEO real well. It was a fun deal. We're getting a good price. And, what could go wrong? What could go wrong? Mad cow disease could go wrong. So all of a sudden, my customers all over the world were dying. And the guy who was the chair of the or president CEO of this company, he called me and said, Joe, I cannot close this deal. I'm a public company. I'll be crucified if this thing turns out to be worse than we think. And I mean, I got a $300,000 or $400,000 walkaway bonus, so that was helpful. And literally, I came back and spent the next year and a half selling it to the same company once the panic had subsided. But so anyway, I guess that's not, again, my specialty is not answering the questions you asked, but that's kind of a variation on that theme of deals falling apart. And you think you've got them all lined up, and you have to say, one last comment. I always tell people that are buying real estate, don't fall in love with the real estate, but don't fall in love with it until you actually own it, because you'll give up way too much near the end if you fall in love with it. So it doesn't mean anything to me. Once it's mine, now it's the best piece of real estate in the world. Prior to that, it's a piece of junk that I don't really want. And I keep telling myself and the other guy that. So,
Just even building on that, I'll commonly tell clients the same thing in reverse, which is I see people who sell a company, especially if it's their first or only business they've done, and they are really emotionally attached to it. And so the idea of selling it, you can almost see the psychological process wherein they have to, it's like losing a child to them in some strange way where they separate or distance from it. And so for them, it's much harder to think about stepping back in. I tell them, convince yourself that you're going to stay here owning this thing long term. If the sale falls through, it's good news because you're going to make it worth more money and you're going to sell it to the same buyer or some other buyer in 6 or 12 more months or 24 more months for a heck of a lot more money, for millions more.
Yeah, that's a repeated theme. Let's talk about that in the next episode because that's a theme that I think a lot about, the defining yourself as am I the cattle guy? Am I the steel business guy? Am I the whatever? And how that can work for you or more often than not against you.
Well, we've come to the end here, Joe. If you had any one last piece of input you would want to have, if you were thinking, hey, if I'm you, the viewer, the listener of this podcast, here's a takeaway that I think you should leave here with. What's the one takeaway that you would hope they would leave here with? And we'll end with that.
I guess, I don't know if I got the ideas across really about risk, but it's a certain amount of self-reflection. And basically, like if you were consulting with yourself and you said, okay, David, I've just looked at what you've done over the last 10 years, which things worked out, which ones you didn't maximize. And you need to ratchet your risk tolerance 3 degrees to the right, not 38 degrees, but 3 degrees. And so I'd say just look at yourself and say, do I have some things that are continually holding me back? And is there a way to just overcome them intellectually and make a decision to throw the dice?
That's fantastic. So here we are at the end of another episode of The Business Coach. To our audience, thank you. Please make sure you hit the subscribe button. Joe, thank you for joining us today. You had so much good insight and wisdom that was gained over the last 35, 40 years in business. Thank you for sharing it with our audience today.
It was my pleasure. I enjoyed the conversation.
Bye, everybody.